A shy girl who can't talk to handsome guys gets a new neighbor, her favorite actor. Nobody expected the relationship that blossomed between them. Mary was a freelance graphic designer who lived in a small yet cozy apartment surrounded by plants. Each morning, she woke up early, turned on her computer, and began working for clients she would never actually meet face to face. That routine soothed her, as it spared her direct contact with strangers, especially those men she considered too attractive. She felt her shyness kept her at arm's length from the rest of the world. She recalled her teenage years, marked by a growing social phobia whenever she had to deal with handsome boys. In high school, several classmates made fun of her silences, mistaking them for arrogance. Those humiliations left a profound wound. There was a time when Matt, a particularly cruel classmate, recorded her stammering class presentation and spread it around. Ever since, whenever an attractive man drew near, her heart pounded and her mind went blank. She couldn't bear reliving that nightmare. Over time, Mary learned to handle herself in adult life, but she never completely got over her extreme shyness. Her days flowed by in what her best friend Lucy called a bubble. That bubble included her computer, her designs, and a collection of movies she watched with devotion. Among all of them, Donald's films were her favorites. He was a famous actor, charismatic, with a captivating voice. Mary found refuge in those stories, feeling they protected her from the real world. Each night, after adjusting fonts or retouching photos, she would settle on the couch with a soft blanket and a cup of tea. She immersed herself in Donald's romantic dramas or action flicks, admiring his elegance and self-assurance. To her, watching him on screen was like daydreaming without risking rejection or ridicule. Secretly, she fantasized about meeting him one day, though the mere thought of looking him in the eye made her freeze. Lucy, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, outgoing, with a packed social calendar. She often invited Mary to go out, arguing that she needed to tackle her fears. She tried convincing her to join dance or yoga classes to meet new people, but Mary always found some excuse to stay home. Her terror of being judged prevailed. One afternoon, while she was working on an illustration for an ad campaign, Lucy texted, insisting they meet that very night. Mary agreed, although she feared running into other friends at the gathering. Yet, upon arriving at Lucy's place, she discovered it was just Lucy and her lazy cat, Toro. Lucy had prepared pasta with a creamy sauce and opened a bottle of wine. Amid laughter, they talked about their day-to-day lives. Eventually, the conversation turned to Mary's chronic shyness and her obsession with Donald. Lucy was convinced it was time for Mary to break free of her bubble. Mary lowered her eyes, remembering those high school taunts and the way she seized up whenever she tried talking to a good-looking man. Still, she admitted that she couldn't keep running away. Her workload was expanding, requiring her to interact more with high-profile clients. Besides, she yearned to feel the thrill of genuine romance. Seeing Lucy's sincere concern, she understood the moment had come to face her fear, though she had no clue how to begin. When she got home, she put away her jacket and collapsed onto the couch. She turned on the TV and selected one of Donald's movies, the one where he played a young dreamer struggling to succeed in a world ruled by shallow pretenses. She found herself identifying with his inner battle. He wanted something deeper, far from the hubbub of fame. She was moved by the authenticity of his performance, wishing that someone so genuine could actually exist. As the credits rolled, she caught herself pondering her own situation. Maybe she could be braver, attempt new experiences, and perhaps even meet someone real who might spark her heart. Yet the memory of the boy who recorded her back in high school still popped up uninvited, like a ghost holding her prisoner in the past. Before she went to bed, she decided her timidity would no longer dictate the course of her life. While switching off the lights, she thought about going out more with Lucy, or at least daring to do what she had avoided for so long, meeting new people. Little did she know that life was about to take an unexpected, incredibly thrilling turn. Overcome by exhaustion, she drifted off to sleep, unaware that the next day something astonishing would begin to shatter her bubble forever. Mr. Andrew, the building's doorman, was a kind, cheerful man who loved to share the latest news with all the neighbors. That morning, as he swept the entrance, he was brimming with excitement. He approached every resident on their way out, and in a voice that trembled slightly, announced that a very special new tenant would be moving in soon. He wouldn't reveal names, but he emphasized just how lucky they were to have him. A playful gleam danced in his eyes, stirring more curiosity than certainty. Eva, the neighbor from the floor below, was the first to spread all sorts of rumors. She claimed she'd heard the name of a famous singer, then guessed maybe it was a star soccer player, and even imagined an important politician as a possibility. She had no real foundation for her claims, but her infectious energy and craving for exclusives ensured everyone paid attention. By midday, the building was abuzz with speculation over who this intriguing newcomer could be. That afternoon, Lucy, who often visited Mary, arrived swept up in the swirl of rumors. She climbed the stairs and knocked insistently on the door. When Mary opened it, Lucy could barely contain her excitement. She hugged her and told her that, according to Mr. Andrew, the new tenant was incredibly famous. Mary raised her eyebrows, not quite sure how to respond. Deep inside, a tiny, hopeful voice wondered if maybe it could be Donald, but she swiftly banished the thought to avoid disappointment. After all, what were the odds that her favorite actor would end up living in the very same building? Probably some singer or athlete, Mary said, forcing herself to sound indifferent. What if it's Donald? Lucy teased, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. Mary sighed, trying not to betray her excitement. No, that's impossible. Besides, why would such a famous actor choose to live here? Lucy shrugged, and although she refrained from contradicting her, she still suspected something big was about to happen. Mary's heart pounded each time the idea of bumping into Donald in the hallway crossed her mind. Yet she reminded herself to stay grounded. Dreaming too big usually led to heartbreak. Better not to feed fantasies that could shatter in an instant. Over the next few days, the building turned into a hive of curiosity. Some neighbors kept close watch on the front entrance, ready to greet the very special newcomer. Mr. Andrew, clearly amused, only fueled the mystery with comments like, "You'll understand when you see him, you'd never guess," or "He's someone nobody overlooks." His playful hints created more tension than was necessary, and even sparked impromptu gatherings in the lobby to trade theories. Mary tried her best to stay focused on her design work. She spent her mornings reading client emails, refining mock-ups, and sending proposals. Still, whenever she went to the supermarket or checked her mailbox, she heard more whispers about the famous tenant. Curiosity began to creep in, no matter how much she wanted to ignore it. Could it really be Donald? Lucy insisted that life was full of coincidences, and despite her denial, Mary was starting to believe, however faintly, that it might be true. One afternoon, as she was picking out her weekly groceries, she bumped into Eva in the fruit aisle. Beaming, Eva told her that boxes had already arrived for the apartment upstairs, insisting they were top-quality decorations. She claimed to have seen labels from production companies, hinting it was someone in show business. Mary felt her chest tighten, but pretended not to care, opting to remain quiet while wishing the conversation would quickly end. Finally, the entire building learned the new tenant had arrived. A moving truck parked out front, unloading several suitcases. Mr. Andrew greeted the newcomer warmly and took him on a quick tour of the facilities. The man wore dark glasses and a cap, as though trying not to draw attention. Still, the nosiest neighbors pressed against their windows, hoping to catch every possible detail. Mary didn't find out right away. She was immersed in an important project that entire morning. Lucy had tried calling to say the move was in full swing, but Mary hadn't picked up. She stayed glued to her computer screen until her doorbell rang repeatedly. Bewildered, she set down her mouse and went to answer, expecting to see Lucy, or maybe even Eva. Instead, she opened the door to a sight that left her absolutely frozen. Right there, without glasses or a cap, stood Donald, the very same Donald whose voice and smile she had adored on screen for so long. At first, she thought it was a dream or some trick of her imagination. But his deep voice dispelled any doubts when he greeted her with a polite hello. He explained he had just moved into the apartment upstairs and had received a package meant for her. Mary, tongue-tied, stood there unable to speak. She tried to smile, but only managed to move her lips slightly. Seeing her reaction, Donald stayed courteous, holding the package out for her to take. Inside, Mary kept telling herself to act normal, that she couldn't faint right there in front of him. But her nerves won out, and she only managed to whisper a barely audible, "Thank you." Even so, Donald gave her a kind smile before saying goodbye. As soon as she shut the door, Mary leaned against the wall. Her idol, the man whose voice and grin she'd admired on screen, was now her new neighbor. A whirlwind of emotions seized her: excitement, terror, disbelief. Unsure how to process it, she took a few steps toward the living room, clinging to one clear thought. From that moment on, her life would never be the same. From the moment Mary closed the door after that brief encounter, nerves took hold of her. She felt a strange tickle in her stomach whenever she remembered Donald's polite smile and unmistakable voice. Still, rather than handling the situation naturally, she decided to pretend she barely knew who he was. Her fear of looking pathetic led her to craft the simplest lie: act as though he didn't interest her. Of course, that was the opposite of reality, but she believed it would at least spare her any embarrassing moments. She didn't want him to find out how much he intimidated her, nor that she had spent countless nights watching his movies. And so, Mary convinced herself that this feigned indifference would shield her from her own fears. Over the next few days, they crossed paths a couple of times in the hallway. Donald would smile and greet her kindly, but she only managed curt responses, barely looking at him. Inwardly, she berated herself. She knew she never intended to appear rude. Somehow, her extreme shyness made her act in a harsh, distant way. Once she was back in her apartment, she could feel her heart pounding and would think about how absurd it all was. Her idol lived just a few steps away, yet instead of being happy, she was building an invisible wall between them. Meanwhile, Donald was dealing with his own mix of confusion and unease. He had come to this building seeking some peace, far from media pressure. Yet his agent, Daryl, kept calling non-stop to remind him of commitments and the need to stay in the spotlight. Daryl didn't understand Donald's urgency to disconnect from fame and take a breather. Each call left him more uncertain. He didn't want to give up the opportunities his career offered, but he also didn't feel happy about the whirlwind of events and appearances required of him. He needed a break to prepare for his new role calmly. Mary's apparent coldness, coupled with the stress from his agent, was starting to weigh on Donald. Usually people he met either treated him with adoration or showed excessive interest in his name. Seeing Mary so detached made him suspect she didn't appreciate his presence. For a moment, he imagined she might be one of those fussy neighbors who couldn't stand the commotion or hassle that came with showbiz. He wondered if she was prejudiced against him or if there had been some misunderstanding he was unaware of. Even so, he kept trying to be polite whenever they crossed paths in the halls or the elevator. One Friday morning, Mary was carrying a load of folders and print samples for work. Turning the corner in the hallway, she ran right into Donald. He offered to help with the folders, holding out a friendly arm, but she jerked back involuntarily. Between her shyness and her fear of giving herself away, she shook her head and murmured, "No, thanks," before hurrying off. She instantly reproached herself, knowing she should have accepted his help. But the paralysis she felt in his presence overpowered any sense of logic. By the time she reached her door, she heard his bewildered, "Have a good day," fading behind her. Meanwhile, Daryl's pressure kept mounting. He would call Donald at all hours, bringing up pending interviews, invitations to TV shows, and advertising campaigns. He was blunt in demanding Donald quit hiding and start attending upcoming events, arguing that his heartthrob image was still very lucrative for brands. Donald sighed, setting his phone aside. He felt obligated to maintain that perfect idle facade, yet longed for something different. He thought back to the warmth of a simpler life, those rare moments when he could go out for a walk without bodyguards or paparazzi chasing him. One afternoon, he decided to cook something light in his new apartment and invite Mary over for dinner. He figured a friendly gesture might break the tension. Summoning his courage, he went up to her door and knocked softly. Mary opened it, looking both surprised and alarmed. He offered his best smile, holding a small note with the invitation. But when he noticed her serious expression, he stammered out a few incoherent phrases. Mary, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions, simply made excuses about having a lot of work. As she closed the door, she felt like smacking her forehead. Why was she acting like this? Maybe she really did need Lucy's advice to stop making things so complicated. The days went by, and the awkwardness between them only grew. Donald began to assume his neighbor preferred to keep her distance for some personal reason he didn't understand, and he tried not to force any more encounters. Still, he was intrigued by how hurried she always seemed when he was near. Sometimes he caught a flicker of nerves in her eyes, puzzling him. He wondered if that apparent coldness was really genuine shyness or simply her way of maintaining privacy. That was how Donald's first weeks in the building became marked by misunderstandings. Mary hid behind her own embarrassment, acting as though she didn't recognize the famous actor, while Donald read her behavior as dislike or disapproval. Both found themselves stuck in roles they didn't really want, held back by their own insecurities. He, overwhelmed by Daryl's constant calls and the feeling he wasn't welcome, and she, caught in her fear of being exposed and of her idol discovering just how vulnerable she truly was. A new day dawned, and with Donald's recent arrival, the building's residents were in a state of constant anticipation. Eva, the enthusiastic and gossip-loving neighbor, decided to take matters into her own hands by planning a little welcome party so that everyone could get a closer look at their famous new tenant. In her view, it was the best way to include him and show off the warmth of the neighborhood. Mr. Andrew, always ready to help, jumped on the idea with genuine goodwill. He had no idea that his offhanded remarks about Donald's schedule would only fuel everyone's curiosity even more. When Eva announced the possible party, Mary froze. She didn't like the intrusion, but a small part of her actually wanted to join in and maybe tear down the wall of misunderstanding she'd built with Donald. Yet every time she pictured him surrounded by all the neighbors, she felt short of breath. Lucy, on the other hand, was all for it when she heard the news and encouraged Mary to accept, believing a community event would allow for a more natural encounter without so much direct pressure. Even so, just imagining herself in a big group setting with her favorite actor made Mary's nerves run wild. A few days passed, and in the midst of all these plans, an incident disrupted the building's calm. One afternoon, a power outage plunged the hallways into total darkness. The emergency lights failed to turn on, cloaking the place in an unsettling silence. Soon after, rumors spread that there might be a water leak in the basement, potentially serious if not fixed right away. Alarmed, Mr. Andrew rushed around looking for flashlights and asking for help. Eva, for her part, went from door to door warning residents to stay alert. Fate had it that Donald and Mary were both on the ground floor when everything happened. She had gone down to pick up a package in the lobby. He was returning from an impromptu photo shoot downtown. In the hallway, lit only faintly by what sunlight filtered through from outside, they saw the worried faces of the other neighbors. Through hushed conversations, they learned the water pump might have broken, causing leaks and jeopardizing water supply to the upper floors. Without hesitation, Donald offered to help check the fuse box and the basement access. Despite her shyness, Mary felt she couldn't just stand idly by. Lucy, who had come by to visit Mary, arrived right in the thick of the confusion. Seeing her friend trying to reassure some nervous residents, she realized this was the perfect chance for Mary to show her resourceful side. Although Mary usually froze in the presence of attractive men, she was different when she had a specific problem to solve. Without a second thought, Lucy urged her toward the stairway leading to the basement, where Donald and Mr. Andrew were discussing the best way to fix the leak. In the dim light, Donald's calm voice echoed. He was explaining to Mr. Andrew that he had once helped with minor home repairs growing up, so he knew a bit about pipes and electrical circuits. Following Lucy's lead, Mary hovered in the doorway, listening. Sensing she could be useful, she stepped forward to suggest they check the main water valve first. Mr. Andrew brushed it aside, but Donald turned around with interest, encouraging her to come closer and elaborate on her idea. For the first time since he'd moved in, they spoke at length. Mary noticed that he watched her intently, with no hint of judgment or annoyance. She began describing where the valve was located and how it could be shut off temporarily to prevent further damage. Her voice trembled slightly, but Donald listened carefully, handing her a flashlight and nodding. Mr. Andrew, surprised at their interaction, watched them disappear together into the maze of pipes. From behind, Lucy stifled a smile as she noticed how Mary's shyness seemed to fade when she focused on a clear objective. Working together, they found the leak. Mary, soaked to her knees, held the flashlight while Donald closed the valve with a wrench Mr. Andrew had supplied. Between the two of them, they managed to stop the water from spilling out. At last, the dripping sound subsided and everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief. When they came back upstairs, they realized the electricity had been fully restored, allowing the neighbors to finally relax. Eva, with her ever-festive spirit, hurried to congratulate everyone and once again bring up the idea of a welcome party. Amid nervous laughter, people applauded Mary and Donald for their work. Lucy, witnessing a genuine closeness between her friend and the actor, was moved by the scene. Surrounded by praise, Donald looked around for Mary and offered her a warm, almost conspiratorial smile. She sensed in his gaze a glimmer of gratitude and camaraderie that touched her deeply. For a moment, they were alone on the staircase. The rest of the neighbors' voices were muffled by distance. Donald, leaning against the banister, studied her with curiosity and said, "Thanks for your help today. If it weren't for your idea to shut off the valve, the basement would have flooded." Mary felt her cheeks grow warm, but she mustered the courage to glance fleetingly into his eyes. "It wasn't a big deal. I just remembered a similar problem we had once," she murmured, attempting to sound calm. "Well, it was a great help to me, believe me," he replied, his tone gentler now. Before the silence could turn awkward, Lucy appeared to announce that Mr. Andrew wanted to show Donald the results of the fix. Mary used the excuse of her drenched clothes and hurried upstairs, her heart pounding. She realized that something had shifted during the crisis, a small link of mutual understanding. He wasn't an inaccessible diva, nor was she an indifferent neighbor. Unintentionally, the building's mishap had granted them a moment of genuine connection. That day ended with the building slowly returning to normal. Lights once again illuminated every floor, and the pipes no longer posed a threat. Still, there was a palpable sense of change in the air, as though the spark of connection between Mary and Donald had ignited something new in both their lives. Eva remained bent on organizing her party. Lucy smiled proudly at her friend, and Mr. Andrew busied himself recounting every detail. Meanwhile, Mary and Donald, despite all doubts, began chipping away at the walls that had separated them. The days passed uneventfully after the makeshift basement repairs. The building returned to its usual pace, and both Mary and Donald started to feel more at ease. Since that water leak incident, she had gained a sliver of confidence in realizing that working with him didn't have to be uncomfortable. Yet that faint hope of normalcy would be shaken when Mary's past reappeared without warning. It all started one afternoon, as Mary returned from a meeting with a new client. Stepping into the lobby, she saw Mr. Andrew chatting with a tall, athletic man dressed casually and carrying a briefcase. As she walked by, he turned slowly, and their eyes met. Mary instantly recognized those eyes that, in her adolescence, had once looked at her so cruelly. It was Matt, the former classmate who had tormented her so much. Suddenly, she felt transported back to those high school classrooms, tense, pulse racing, desperate to run away. What unnerved her most was the ambiguous smile Matt gave her. He seemed pleased to have found her. Trying to maintain composure, she merely nodded coldly and dashed up the stairs. A flood of bitter memories surged in her mind. The mocking laughter, the viral videos exposing her nerves during presentations, the hurtful remarks that had chipped away at her confidence. She'd spent years trying to leave it all behind, but seeing him there in her refuge felt like a crushing blow. That same night, curled up on her couch with her laptop open, she couldn't concentrate. She messaged Lucy to tell her what had happened. Her friend sounded alarmed, asking why Matt might be hanging around the building. Lucy suspected that Donald's presence could have drawn in people with media ties, and she feared Matt was planning something shady. After all, according to social media, he worked for a production company that sought out exclusive content on celebrities. He could easily have shown up looking for a scoop. Reading her friend's theory sent a chill through Mary. Running into her old bully right now was too much to be coincidence. Confirmation arrived a few days later, when Matt cornered her in the hallway. Putting on an air of fake politeness and that condescending tone she remembered all too well, he told her he'd heard rumors of a major actor living in the building and that his production company was interested in making an exclusive feature. He emphasized the word as though it were a trophy. Then he bombarded her with questions. So is Donald really living here? When do you see him in the halls? Have you had the chance to talk to him? Mary, uncomfortable, refused to answer. But Matt's persistence made her physically back away as if she wanted to vanish. The scene got even worse when he threw in poisonous remarks, reminding her of their high school years and insinuating that no one would believe there could be any genuine closeness between Mary and a big star. You were always quiet and weird, Mary. Don't you think it's unlikely someone like that would pay attention to you? He sneered, that old mocking tone sending her right back to her teenage humiliation. She tried to stand firm, but her voice shook when she told him she had nothing to share. From that point on, Matt became a recurring presence around the building. He managed to be there in the lobby or near the elevator, always looking to catch a moment and pry information from her. When he wasn't pestering her directly, he asked Eva or even Mr. Andrew questions, insisting it was all for a journalistic project in the public's interest. Eva, for her part, loved any hint of breaking news and failed to see that she was feeding into the schemes of someone with questionable motives. Mr. Andrew, simply eager to be helpful, didn't suspect he might be jeopardizing Donald's newfound peace. Mary felt increasingly harassed by her ex-classmate. Each time they crossed paths, she was thrown back into the insecurities she thought she'd conquered. The bit of courage she'd built up started to unravel under Matt's sneering gaze. One afternoon, while coming back from the supermarket with several bags, she found him loitering by the front entrance. He offered to help her, wearing a smug expression. When she declined, he followed her a few steps, hurling old teenage nicknames at her and making it clear he knew she had some connection to Donald. "You can say whatever you want, but I'm sure you know more than you're letting on," he said, barely masking the threat in his tone. That night, Mary called Lucy in despair. She confessed she felt the same fear and helplessness she had years ago. Now that her relationship with Donald was becoming more cordial, she worried Matt would ruin everything. She didn't want to drag Donald into problems or allow the press to stir up trouble. Besides, her old inner voice was whispering that maybe Matt was right. How could someone like Donald be interested in her, a timid woman who froze at the mere idea of any close interaction? Over the following days, she tried to steer clear of Matt, but he always managed to intercept her. He continued firing off malicious comments disguised as jokes, trying to make her cave and give him something for his production company. The constant assault on her self-esteem caused Mary to withdraw. She started going out less and ignoring Lucy's invitations. All the progress she had made in recent weeks dissolved, her old wounds torn open once more. Just when she thought things couldn't get worse, she found a message from Matt slipped under her door. He asked her to meet and chat in a friendly way, hinting that he could help her make the most of having a celebrity living so close by. Mary read it with trembling hands, realizing his harassment wasn't going to stop on its own. That buried fear crept back in, of being humiliated in front of Donald, or worse, causing him trouble. Once again, the shadow of her adolescence hung over her. And so that day ended, leaving Mary feeling caught between her desire for freedom and the reappearance of an old nemesis. The promise of a budding bond with Donald was now threatened by rumors and Matt's relentless meddling. Her past stood in the way, reminding her of the mockery she had endured and pushing her to believe she might never escape that sense of inadequacy. With a heavy heart, she braced herself for whatever might come, fearing that the fragile confidence she was beginning to build would crumble before it had the chance to bloom. Daryl showed up without warning one morning, just as Donald was heading out for a quiet coffee at a nearby cafe. The agent looked more flustered than usual. Donald was taken aback. This was Daryl's first visit to the building since he had moved in, hoping to find some peace. Without delay, Daryl confronted him at the entrance and insisted, more like demanded, that they go up to his apartment to talk in private. They rode the elevator in silence, with Mr. Andrew watching them curiously, unsure of what was happening. Once inside the living room, Daryl raised his voice, scolding Donald for having dodged commitments for weeks. He reminded him that major brands were interested in his image, that his fan base expected to see him in interviews and on red carpets. Donald, who had been trying to escape the media frenzy, felt his breath quicken from the tension. Daryl then laid out a damning statement. "You're taking a risk by letting people forget you. Even worse, if rumors start flying that you're hiding out for some scandal or that you're involved with someone unknown, it could tarnish your unattainable heartthrob image." Those words echoed in Donald's mind. He knew Daryl was ultimately concerned about keeping him at the top of the industry, but he was tired of feeling like he didn't own his personal life. He needed sanctuary, and this unremarkable building was giving him a safe space to recharge. He explained, in as calm a tone as he could manage, that he needed inspiration for his new role, one far more human and removed from the showbiz spotlight. Daryl, however, was unyielding, insisting that if he was seen with anyone who wasn't also a celebrity, the media would twist it or tarnish his reputation as an untouchable leading man. After a tense argument, Daryl sighed and tried to lower his voice, reminding Donald that any misstep could be costly. Before leaving, he looked at him with a sort of weary concern. "If you want to hide out here, fine, but don't expect everyone to understand, and watch the people around you. Be very careful." When the door finally closed, Donald was overcome with both anger and relief. Anger because it seemed he couldn't even choose who to spend time with, and relief because at least Daryl was gone for the time being. Over the next few days, Donald reflected on his agent's words and resolved that he couldn't keep living up to the perfect heartthrob image at the expense of his own happiness. He began noticing how everyday life provided him with details that fed his creativity. The warmth of his neighbors, the trivial hallway chats, the spontaneous laughter of people who didn't expect anything from him beyond a polite hello. Without realizing it, he began to notice how Mary behaved, even with her obvious shyness. Every time their eyes met or they had a brief encounter, he perceived a genuineness that moved him deeply. Their chats progressed almost without either of them planning it. They ran into each other in the lobby or in the elevator, and instead of avoiding him, she dared to hold a few seconds of conversation. In turn, he tried asking about her work as a designer, fascinated by her ability to create from the calm of her own apartment. One day, he ventured to ask her opinion on a script he had to study, and her reaction surprised him. Though very nervous, she showed real interest and shared her ideas on the emotional development of characters. That honesty made her feel useful, and for a while, she forgot her fears. In those conversations, Mary began to glimpse the man behind the celebrity. She discovered that Donald wasn't always self-assured. that he often grappled with the pressures of fame, and that deep down, he longed for a simpler life. She related to his feelings, as she too desired peace away from people's judgment, especially since Matt had come back to haunt her with her past. For the first time, she understood that fame did not necessarily protect one from insecurities. In many cases, it intensified them. It was during one of those chats, next to the emergency stairs, where few people ever passed, that Donald opened up to Mary. He confessed that he felt trapped between what his audience expected and what he truly wanted for his career. He was afraid of letting down those who pinned their hopes on him, but he also dreaded continuing in a lifestyle that overwhelmed him. As Mary listened intently, she realized he wasn't the only one struggling under the weight of other people's opinions. She felt a kinship and admitted that she too carried painful memories that held her back. She didn't go into detail, but he noticed the sadness in her eyes and didn't push, showing a respect that moved her. This new bond was beginning to brighten both of their days, though each carried their own conflicts. Mary was still troubled by Matt's veiled threats. Sure, he was only looking to cause trouble. Donald, on the other hand, wrestled with the calm he found around her and Daryl's constant phone calls, urging him to sign on to advertising campaigns and attend events. It seemed inevitable that his agent's interests would clash with his growing emotions. Daryl viewed any personal relationship as a risk to Donald's marketability, while Donald was coming to realize that for the first time in ages, he wanted the freedom to choose whom to share his personal life with. In this way, a seed of deeper understanding took root between Mary and Donald. Their conversations had the warmth of two people finding solace in each other's empathy. Yet there was a sense of opposing forces at play. While Daryl demanded obedience to the rules of show business, Matt lurked about with increasingly sinister motives, and Mary's shyness threatened to push her back into silence. Still, something in their talks made them believe that, no matter how different their worlds were, there was a genuine connection. And although they couldn't yet fully express it, both suspected that this closeness would be hard to stop. The following days carried a different energy throughout the building. From the hallways to the lobby, one could feel the buzz of curiosity fueled by the sudden closeness between Mary and Donald. On the one hand, some neighbors watched them chatting more often, exchanging casual comments, or just passing each other with shy smiles. On the other, Eva and Mr. Andrew remained excited about the idea of a secret story unfolding before their very eyes. Unbeknownst to them, that atmosphere of rumor was about to intensify with Matt's meddling. Mary's old high school classmate had spent days skulking around, searching for any detail that might link her to the famous actor. Nothing escaped him, not the smallest gesture or word that confirmed what he already suspected, that something special was going on between them. His goal was to sell this information to the press, gain notoriety, and in the process, fulfill his long-standing obsession of humiliating Mary. Seeing things evolve little by little between her and Donald, he decided to take action. Matt started with a simple plan: follow Donald whenever he left the building, watch his routine, and snap photos from a distance. But he hit a snag. Donald was discreet. He usually went out wearing a cap and dark glasses, avoiding crowded places. Frustrated, Matt found another angle. He'd seek the unwitting help of the neighbors, who seemed more than willing to share whatever they knew. That's when Eva, the enthusiastic neighbor, became the perfect source. Believing Matt to be a friend of Donald, or at least a genuine fan, she casually mentioned certain details. He usually goes out early on Mondays. I think he has rehearsals somewhere, she confided, clearly enjoying the sense of conspiratorial gossip. He comes back with shopping bags 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes he likes to jog at sunset, she added, proud of her insider knowledge. She believed she was simply sharing harmless neighborhood gossip with someone who seemed friendly. She had no idea what Matt was really after. Mr. Andrew also fell into the trap, without bad intentions. Enamored with the idea of having a movie star in his building, he spoke with an enthusiasm rivaling Eva's. He recounted the day Donald and Mary had dealt with the basement leak together, even detailing how he'd seen them down there late that evening checking the pipes. This was gold for Matt. If they'd been seen alone at night, was there more going on than mere neighborly support? For a sensationalist publication, it could be spun as a secret romance. Matt's imagination took off as he pictured the headlines he could generate, and the more he fed that fantasy, the more certain he was of how to craft a juicy exposé that would benefit him. Next came the hunt for more concrete proof. Always armed with his phone to snap incriminating photos, Matt looked for vantage points to capture Donald and Mary together. Some mornings, he camped at a nearby cafe to see if they'd show up to shop or head down the same path. Other times, he pretended to be on a call in the lobby while spying on the elevator. With persistence, he managed to get a few blurry shots of them walking down the hallway. They showed no physical contact, but they'd be enough to illustrate a sensational article if framed with the right speculation. While Matt carried out his plan, rumors in the building spread like wildfire. Eva, never missing a chance to comment, spoke loudly about the chemistry she perceived between Mary and Donald. Mr. Andrew, eager to share what he saw as good news, told anyone who would listen how often he'd seen the two chatting, adding that even their mail deliveries turned into brief conversations. The fantasy of a hidden romance grew rapidly among the neighbors, filling every corner with whispers and prying questions. Unaware, Mary and Donald found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of gossip. Lucy, noticing the rumors, tried cautioning Mary about being careful. But the designer, absorbed in her own problems, didn't grasp the scale of these speculations. Although she stayed on guard about Matt, it never occurred to her how deeply he was manipulating all the neighborhood chatter. In her mind, as long as she didn't talk to any media outlets and tried to keep her head down, nothing too serious would come of it. That illusion crumbled when the rumors reached a small local news site. One day, Mr. Andrew was approached by a reporter who, feigning friendliness, asked about the secret relationship of the famous resident. Surprised and flattered by the attention, Mr. Andrew revealed details without realizing that, within hours, an article would be published hinting at a romance between the movie star and an anonymous neighbor. To make things worse, some furtive photos taken by Matt appeared in the piece, fueling the speculation with headlines about nocturnal rendezvous and private moments in secluded places. When the story hit social media, the building's community went wild with reactions. Some were happy about the supposed new couple, others mocked the idea, and still others worried about the invasion of privacy. Lucy messaged Mary, warning her that a certain blog was talking about her and even showing secretly taken photos. A chill ran down Mary's spine as she read the sensationalist titles claiming an exclusive scoop on a budding romance. Meanwhile, Donald, dumbfounded, realized his efforts to keep a low profile had been in vain. Suddenly, tensions soared. The building ceased to be a tranquil refuge and instead became a magnet for curious onlookers and potential paparazzi. And as Mary tried to cope with the chaos, Matt reveled in his success, convinced that this was just the start. The threads of his scheme were finally paying off. The local press had swallowed the bait, and the apparent love story between the famous actor and the shy designer would become, if everything went as planned, the most talked-about story of the season. The echo of rumors had turned into an uproar impossible to ignore. After those first sensational articles came out, the building was no longer a place where Donald and Mary could find relative peace. Now, a quick glance out the window was enough to spot at least one or two people lingering outside. Sometimes there was even a car parked on the curb with a camera lens poking out of the window. Though most neighbors were sympathetic, or at least somewhat embarrassed by the situation, the atmosphere was tense. As for Matt, he was busy plotting his next move. Having supplied intel to the local press, he knew it was time for a more forceful strike. He managed to track down an experienced paparazzo, a man well-versed in the art of stalking celebrities. Matt told him that something big was going on in that building, something that hadn't yet made the national headlines. He promised plenty of explosive moments if the paparazzo followed his instructions, and of course a decent paycheck once he got the incriminating shots. The opportunity arose sooner than expected. One night, the paparazzo stationed himself behind a car on the street, camera at the ready. Around 10 o'clock, he spotted a light on the building's shared rooftop terrace. Someone had gone up there, perhaps to get some fresh air. It was Donald, who often climbed up to clear his head, away from prying eyes. While he stood there looking out over the glowing city, Mary appeared hesitantly a few steps behind. That day had been overwhelming for them both, and with her heart pounding, she decided to thank him for the support he'd been giving her. With all the recent chaos, she couldn't bear to remain silent. For a few moments they looked at each other with that mixture of empathy and weariness that was becoming familiar. Mary apologized for the trouble she believed she'd caused, especially knowing that the press was now hounding him, the famous actor who only wanted some peace of mind. Donald shook his head and assured her it wasn't her fault. He said scandals were part of his profession and that, in any case, he much preferred being in this building than living under his agent's relentless control and forced appearances. That moment of confidences, under the dim light of the terrace bulb, brought them closer than any of their previous conversations ever had. Just then, the paparazzo began snapping photos in rapid succession. His telephoto lens captured every detail, immortalizing the gentle gestures and the closeness between Donald and Mary. She looked away shyly, but he smiled, his expression open and ready to listen. The pictures suggested an intimacy that, to the press, looked like definitive proof of a romance. Down below, hidden by a wall, Matt smiled at the sound of the shutter and knew these shots would fetch a much higher price for the story he intended to sell. By the next morning, the publication of these photos was inevitable. Several showbiz websites led with sensational headlines: "Donald caught on the rooftop with his new flame," and "Famous actor and mystery woman, exclusive images." The pictures of them talking featured knowing glances and close body language. Some even hinted at an embrace that never actually happened. But it was enough for a flood of opinions and theories to swarm social media. The impact was immediate at the building. Groups of reporters and photographers gathered at the entrance, hoping to coax a statement from Donald, or worse, corner Mary with invasive questions. Mr. Andrew did his best to maintain order, asking the newcomers to respect the neighbors' privacy. But controlling the wave of onlookers was practically impossible. Eva, terrified by the commotion, regretted having shared so much information. And Lucy, seeing the scope of the harassment, rushed to warn Mary not to go outside alone. Feeling completely overwhelmed, Mary locked herself in her apartment, unsure what to do. She had only managed to read a few online comments before switching off her phone in horror. That same panic she'd feared for so long, rooted in her high school traumas, came roaring back. She felt ridiculous, exposed to the world's ridicule, criticized for daring to be near a famous actor. Without a second thought, she pulled the curtains shut and huddled on her bed, tears welling up, convinced that hiding was her only option. The hours passed, and someone knocked repeatedly at her door. It was Lucy, pleading to be let in. Mary hesitated, but eventually opened up, relieved to have a friendly face by her side. After an unsteady hug, they sat on the sofa to go over the situation. Lucy tried to calm her, insisting that none of this was Mary's fault. "The press always twists things," she said, outraged, but Mary was convinced she'd destroyed Donald's peace. "If it weren't for me, he wouldn't be caught in this scandal," she lamented. She pictured Matt, his taunts, and the same crushing humiliation she'd felt in her teens. Now, with all this media attention, her worst fears were materializing once again, being mocked, gossiped about, and singled out. Donald, for his part, was grappling with his own nightmare. Although dealing with the press was nothing new to him, the alarming headlines and the swarm of photographers hit him differently this time. It wasn't just about his image. Mary was involved, someone unfamiliar with the spotlight who didn't deserve to be thrust into it. He tried calling her a few times, but she never picked up. He wanted to assure her he didn't blame her, that he understood, and most of all that he had no regrets about talking to her on the rooftop. Daryl, his agent, pressured him to issue some clarifying statement to save his reputation, but Donald's biggest concern was Mary and how she was coping with the fallout. And so, amid the mounting media circus, Mary isolated herself completely, overwhelmed and afraid, and Donald searched in vain for a way to show his support. The situation had reached its climax. Neighbors looked on uneasily at the flood of cameras, Matt reveled in the success of his plot, and the press kept demanding fresh, sensational angles. Heartbroken, Mary kept telling herself she had ruined everything, her wish to escape her bubble of shyness now transformed into a nightmare of the worst kind. The next day, the building was still surrounded by curiosity seekers, reporters, and cameras pointed at every window, hoping for a scoop. Amid this storm of uncertainty, Mary remained cloistered in her apartment, paralyzed by fear. Lucy came to see her daily, trying to coax her outside for some air, but just picturing a paparazzo in the hallway made Mary's skin crawl. Meanwhile, Donald felt increasingly suffocated. On one hand, he wanted to protect her. On the other, he was clashing with the strategies Daryl kept pushing on him. Daryl's proposal was crystal clear. They had to deny any relationship with that nobody and release an official statement distancing themselves. Yet Donald flatly refused to sacrifice Mary in such a way. Frowning in frustration, Daryl insisted that Donald's lucrative, untouchable heartthrob image was at risk, and that the only way to save it was to quash any rumors linking him to a regular person. He reminded him that sponsors wanted to see the actor at events and in ads, not mired in a messy affair with someone outside the spotlight. One afternoon, after another heated argument, Daryl went so far as to suggest that Donald claim Mary had been pestering him for personal gain to ease the media scrutiny. That was the last straw. Unable to tolerate such cynicism, Donald decided to take matters into his own hands. He contacted an independent press team and scheduled a live broadcast, a sort of improvised press conference. Word of Donald's upcoming conference spread quickly, stirring media curiosity. Many expected the usual denial or a ploy to play the victim. The more sensational outlets hoped he'd confirm a secret romance. Nobody anticipated what would actually happen. On the afternoon of the press event, a small hotel room in the city filled with reporters and cameras. Donald arrived looking serious, but showing no nerves. From the very first moment, he made it clear he wasn't there to invent stories. He was accepting full responsibility for the situation and planned to speak honestly. A murmur rippled through the crowd. In his statement, Donald described Mary as a genuine person who had never tried to exploit his fame. He explained that they'd met by chance, as neighbors, and that in a moment of personal turmoil, she had listened to him and offered support when he was uncertain about his career. He admitted he couldn't understand why the press was hounding her, given she hadn't left her apartment to spread anything. With a steady voice, he went further. "She's not just some stranger. She's someone who has shown me more loyalty than many who claim to be my friends, and I'm not going to let anyone turn her into a target of rumors or ridicule." The crowd held its breath. Those words boldly defied the silence Daryl had wanted. He then spoke about the leaked photos, calmly explaining that the terrace pictures had been taken without his consent during a private moment of trust. He used the chance to highlight the invasion of his privacy and demanded respect not just for himself, but for everyone who chose to live away from the public eye. "Is it so shocking," he asked, "that someone might have friends who aren't in the industry? That you'd talk with a neighbor about your fears and uncertainties? Apparently so, and I'm sorry for that." The room buzzed with questions, but he remained composed, reiterating that he wouldn't play the game of denying something that wasn't wrong in the first place. The name Matt began circulating among the journalists at that point as the likely source of the leaks. Some, better informed, already knew of his background and his ties to the company that had sold the photos. With every answer Donald gave, attention shifted more onto this mysterious informant. One reporter seized the moment to reveal evidence linking Matt to the sale of the exclusive and the editing of the images. Realizing that the true story was coming out, several outlets prepared to investigate further. The result was swift. Matt was exposed as the main instigator, someone motivated by past grudges to profit financially while smearing Mary's name. When word of this reached Matt's production company, they summoned him immediately. After a brief internal investigation, his bosses confirmed that he had indeed contacted a paparazzo and sold them the material, violating confidentiality rules. Overnight, Matt went from being an efficient employee to a huge liability, and his credibility in the media world took a nosedive. Many of the building's residents, initially unaware of his schemes, felt anger and betrayal upon learning he'd manipulated them for information. As for Daryl, watching this all unfold, he realized that his push to control Donald's image was colliding with a far more powerful reality. The actor's resolve to protect the people he cared about, no matter the commercial fallout. He stared in amazement, as by telling the truth, Donald earned the support of a sizable portion of the public, who applauded his courage. He understood that if he continued trying to suppress his client and refused to stand by him, he might lose him entirely. Confronted with that dilemma, Daryl backed down. He stopped pressuring Donald with ad contracts and bogus statements, unwilling to destroy the last vestiges of trust between them. The press conference brought a drastic turning point to the whole affair. Donald had chosen, without ambiguity, to put Mary's well-being above his own heartthrob reputation. By deprioritizing his public image, he broke free from the manipulation and lies swirling around him. The online response was immediate. Many hailed him as brave for calling out media abuse and defending someone who had no means to protect herself. Others, of course, remained skeptical and kept spinning theories, but Donald's words resonated louder than any tabloid headline. That day, in the very building where the rumor had first taken shape, neighbors learned what happened through headlines and shared videos. Lucy was practically bursting with excitement, ready to race to Mary and tell her that Donald had risked his public stature to defend her. A new phase was about to begin, though the hardest part still lay ahead. For Mary, frightened and embarrassed, to step outside her self-imposed confinement and accept that she had nothing to feel guilty about. Little by little, the media pressure began to ease, and the most important moment was just around the corner. The reconciliation of two people who, in spite of all obstacles, had managed to find a haven of mutual understanding in the midst of scandal. Mary woke up that morning with a strange feeling in her chest. She had watched Donald's press conference video online and still couldn't believe what he'd done to defend her. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that someone so used to the spotlight would defy the norms just to shield her from gossip and intrusive attention. His courage, along with the honesty in his words, moved her to the point of tears. Initially, she still hesitated to leave her apartment. The fear remained, whispering that everyone would still be judging her. Yet Lucy's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that there was nothing to be ashamed of. With her heart pounding, Mary decided to open her apartment door. She peered into the hallway, which lay quiet and still, as if waiting for her. Letting out a sigh, she walked cautiously toward the stairs leading down to the lobby, wondering if Donald might be nearby. Halfway down, she stopped upon hearing familiar footsteps. Looking up, she saw him coming from the entrance, appearing calm, but with a flicker of anxiety in his eyes. It seemed he was searching for her. They stood motionless for what felt like an eternity. Right there, in that same hallway that had been the scene of so many awkward encounters, they found themselves needing to speak honestly. Mary felt a lump in her throat as she recalled how, not long ago, she could hardly greet him. Now, after such a roller coaster, they were face to face with their emotions laid bare. "I didn't think you'd come out so soon," Donald said quietly, giving her a cautious smile. "I wasn't even sure I'd have the courage to step out today," she murmured. Then she took a breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Thank you for what you did. You didn't have to risk so much like that." He shook his head, brushing it off. "I had to. Keeping quiet only fueled the lies. You don't deserve to go through any of this, Mary." For several seconds, there was no need for more words. A couple of neighbors peeked out, noticed the scene, and discreetly withdrew, sensing it was a private moment. Ava and Mr. Andrew, for their part, had learned their lesson from everything that had happened. They no longer wished to meddle in others' personal matters. The doorman had vowed to be much more careful with his anecdotes, and Eva had promised not to spread rumors without thinking about the consequences. Mary and Donald remained standing face to face until she, in a sudden burst of courage she'd never before shown, took a step closer. In that small action was her decision to stop hiding. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know this has caused you trouble, and I don't know how to handle it." Donald assured her there was nothing to forgive. He understood her more than anyone. He too had suffered from insecurities under his career's pressures, and only after moving into that building had he realized how much he craved a simpler life. Sighing, he suggested they head down for a coffee at the little cafe on the corner. "If anyone wants to talk, let them," he added matter-of-factly. Mary, after a brief hesitation, nodded with a shy smile. She sensed that gesture meant more than just stepping out. It was a step toward true freedom. Meanwhile, the side stories surrounding them were resolving one by one. Matt, unmasked as the mastermind behind the leak, slunk away with his tail between his legs, his reputation in tatters. He tried to defend himself by claiming he'd only been following his production company's orders, but they turned their backs on him once his malicious intentions were confirmed. Many building residents, now outraged, shut him out. His plan to climb the media ladder ended up destroying his own credibility, leaving him both jobless and disgraced. Darryl, Donald's agent, admitted he'd gone too far in his zeal to preserve his client's image. He understood that excessive pressure and dishonest strategies would only have driven the actor away for good. Accepting defeat, he relented and let Donald handle his private life without further interference. That didn't mean he would stop representing him, but it did mark a change in their working dynamic. From then on, Donald would have full say in any matters affecting his personal life. Lucy celebrated every small victory of Mary's. She watched her friend with pride as she dared to go out, dared to look straight at someone who once made her freeze, and dared to speak openly about her fears. She also noticed how, despite her doubts, Mary now radiated a newfound confidence. She advised her to enjoy this phase without agonizing over what others might say. "You've come this far through your own efforts," Lucy reminded her. "No one can take away what you've built." The epilogue of this story played out on a sunny afternoon, with Mary and Donald strolling through the nearest park. Though they were no longer surrounded by hordes of photographers, there were still some curious glances. This time, though, neither of them felt self-conscious. They walked among the trees, chatting about upcoming projects and the idea of facing obstacles together. At one point, Mary dared to laugh openly at something funny Donald said. That carefree, liberating laugh showed that her bubble of shyness had truly begun to crack. For his part, Donald, without the need for any charade, felt a serenity he'd never achieved before. In his search for authenticity, he recognized that, despite the difficulties, he needed people who didn't just see him as a star, but as a man with genuine hopes and fears. That connection he'd found in Mary had become so important that no level of fame could replace it. They paused to watch some children playing, and their eyes met in a moment of mutual understanding. They didn't even need to say thank you. With a simple, gentle gesture, they acknowledged each other as two souls who, by colliding, had brought about profound changes in each other's lives. There, in the golden afternoon light, it was clear that this new stage was only just beginning. Neither shyness nor outside pressures could be insurmountable barriers now. They had decided to face the gossip, and by doing so, they'd granted themselves the chance to live without masks, revealing their most human sides, and so ended the most turbulent chapter of their lives. The building returned to calm, with a bit more wisdom than before. Eva and Mr. Andrew learned to be more discreet. Lucy kept cheering her friend on, and Darryl finally accepted Donald's new direction. Meanwhile, Mary and the actor headed back, walking together at an unhurried pace, their fingers interlaced, convinced that, united, they would begin to write a different story, free from the burdens of the past and filled with a youthful, hopeful love. And that's all for today. Thank you for sticking around until the end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you feel like it, leave a comment and share with your friends. See you in the next video. Take care.